A 19-year-old farm boy crouches in a frozen Belgian ravine, fishing line wrapped around his calloused fingers. The kind of fingers that know the weight of a wrench better than a rifle. Behind him, through the skeletal trees and December snow, his company is retreating, boots pounding mud, voices hoarse with exhaustion. Ahead of him, closing fast through the narrow gorge they call the bottleneck, 19 elite German soldiers sprint toward the gap he's supposed to hold. Alone. Silas Miller pulls his father's pocket watch from his coat. 14 seconds until contact. Maybe less. The wind carries the sound of their boots now, that rhythmic thunder of men who believe they're about to cut an American retreat into ribbons. He can hear their voices, sharp commands in German, the metallic click of weapons being readied for slaughter. Corporal Sterling's voice echoes in his head, that same sneer from 2 hours ago when Silas volunteered to stay behind. "That's the stupidest waste of ordnance I've ever seen." Sterling had laughed, actually laughed, as Silas wrapped fishing line around the pins of 120 grenades. Give the kid his toys. Maybe he'll distract them while he dies. Silas doesn't look up from the tripwire. His fingers move with the same precision he learned, fixing tractor engines in his father's barn, testing tension, checking angles, recalculating weight distribution for the 15th time. The wire stretches across the gorge mouth, invisible in the thin December light, anchored to a rusted fence post on one side and a birch tree on the other. 120 grenades rigged in a cascading V pattern along both ravine walls. Each one positioned to fall when the explosion above it severs its line. A chain reaction, a symphony of physics. He just keeps counting. 12 seconds. This is not a story of a soldier who outshot the enemy. This is the story of a boy who outthought them. Silas Miller didn't look like a hero. At 19 he was still gangly, still soft-spoken, still more comfortable explaining the mechanics of a corn thresher than discussing battlefield tactics. Back in Ohio they called him the Quiet One. In basic training, Corporal Sterling christened him Slow Joe, a nickname that stuck like mud because Silas didn't march fast, didn't yell loud, didn't fit the mold of what a soldier was supposed to be. But Silas saw the world differently. Where other men saw chaos, he saw patterns. Where they saw a ravine, he saw angles and trajectories. Where they saw 120 grenades as firepower, he saw mass, velocity, and the elegant mathematics of synchronized detonation. 8 seconds. In the frozen hell of the Ardennes, during the desperate winter of 1944, when the German offensive shattered American lines and sent entire divisions scrambling for survival, the very toys his squad had laughed at were about to become the most efficient killing machine of the breakthrough. A farm boy's stupid trap was about to achieve what an entire battalion couldn't. 4 seconds. How did a kid mocked as Slow Joe engineer a weapon so precise, so devastating, that it would neutralize 119 enemy soldiers in exactly 14 seconds? And why, after surviving the war, after returning to his father's farm in Ohio, did Silas Miller never speak of it again? Why did the man who changed the course of the Ardennes breakthrough spend the rest of his life fixing tractors in silence, as if those 14 seconds of thunder had never happened? 2 seconds. The first German boot enters the gorge. Silas closes his pocket watch and waits for the wire to sing. Before we reveal what happens in those 14 seconds, hit that subscribe button to join our community of history enthusiasts. Drop a comment below with your location and the time you're watching this. Let's see how far Silas's story travels. The boy who had engineered death in a Belgian gorge learned to think in sequences on a failing farm in rural Ohio. Silas Miller was 8 years old the first time he watched his father disassemble a seized tractor engine on the barn floor, laying each part in careful order on a canvas tarp. Pistons, gaskets, crankshaft, valves, like a surgeon preparing for an operation. His father didn't speak much, but his hands told stories. "See that?" His father pointed to a hairline crack in the cylinder head. That's where the problem starts. But it ain't where it ends. One crack means pressure escapes. Pressure escapes means the piston misfires. Piston misfires means the whole engine seizes. Everything connects, Si. You fix the crack, you fix the machine. Everything connects. It became the architecture of Silas's mind. While other boys played war in the cornfields with stick rifles and imaginary grenades, Silas sat in his father's workshop, learning the logic of the machine. How force transfers through gears, how tension distributes across a cable. How a single point of failure can cascade through an entire system, or how a single intervention can prevent catastrophe. By 12, he was fixing things his father couldn't. The well pump that everyone said was dead. The combine harvester with the unfixable timing belt. He didn't see machines as mysterious. He saw them as puzzles with rules, and rules could be learned. The coyotes came the summer he turned 14. A pack of them, lean and desperate, killing chickens and newborn calves under cover of darkness. His father grabbed the shotgun. Silas grabbed a spool of wire, 6 tin cans, and a box of his mother's sewing needles. "You gonna knit them to death?" his father asked. Silas didn't answer. He spent 3 nights in the barn, sketching angles and weights, calculating the tension needed to tip a can filled with stones. When he was done, he'd rigged a perimeter system around the livestock pens, tripwires connected to suspended cans that would crash down in sequence, creating a cascading alarm that would wake the dead. He added the needles last, positioning them at ankle height along the most likely approach paths, not to kill, to discourage. The coyotes came on the 4th night. The first can fell with a metallic scream, then the second, then the third. The entire perimeter erupted in sound and the sharp sting of needle points. The pack scattered and never returned. His father stood in the barn doorway in his nightshirt, watching the last can swing on its wire. "How'd you know they'd come that way?" "Studied their tracks. They always took the path with the least resistance." Silas wound up the wire, checking each connection. "So I made resistance." His father nodded slowly. "That's thinking, son. That's real thinking." It wasn't about violence. It was never about violence. It was about seeing the world as a series of mechanical problems, inputs and outputs, cause and effect, physics and sequence. You didn't need to be stronger than your enemy. You didn't need to be faster. You just needed to understand the architecture of the problem better than they did. Silas saw the world in tripwires and tension, in cascading failures and chain reactions, in the elegant mathematics of one thing leading to another, until a single point of intervention became an avalanche. He just didn't know yet that the enemy wouldn't always be coyotes, or that the stakes wouldn't always be chickens. The United States Army didn't care about coyote traps. In the summer of 1942, when Silas's draft number was called and he stepped off a bus at Fort Benning, Georgia, the Army cared about speed, volume, and aggression. It cared about men who could march in perfect synchronization, who could yell until their voices went hoarse, who could charge forward without hesitation or thought. Silas Miller was none of these things. On the parade ground, while other recruits snapped to attention with mechanical precision, Silas was always half a beat behind, not because he didn't understand the commands, but because his mind was analyzing the efficiency of the formation itself. Why march in rigid columns when a staggered line would offer better firing angles? Why waste energy on synchronized steps when the goal was simply to cover ground? Corporal Vance Sterling noticed on the second day. Sterling was everything the Army wanted in a soldier. 6 feet of Tennessee muscle, with a voice that could strip paint and a natural gift for violence barely contained by his uniform. He'd grown up fighting, thrived on it, and saw basic training as confirmation of what he'd always known. The world belonged to men who were loud, fast, and unafraid to use their fists. You. Sterling planted himself in front of Silas during morning formation, So close Silas could smell the tobacco on his breath. "You got a problem with your legs, farm boy?" "No, Corporal." "Then why are you marching like you're wading through molasses?" "I'm not, Corporal. You're just slow." Sterling's grin was all teeth. "That's what you are. Slow Joe from the slow farm doing his slow-motion shuffle." The other recruits laughed, grateful it wasn't them. The nickname stuck before the sun went down. But put Silas in the armory, and something shifted. The M1903 Springfield rifle was a beautiful machine, 9 pounds of wood and steel engineered for a single purpose. Most recruits fumbled through disassembly, dropping pins and springs, taking 15 minutes to accomplish what the manual said should take 5. Silas broke the record in his second week. Blindfolded. 2 minutes, 43 seconds. He laid each component in perfect sequence on the table. Bolt assembly, firing pin, extractor, magazine follower, trigger guard. His fingers reading the metal like braille. When the drill sergeant removed the blindfold, every piece was positioned exactly where it needed to be for flawless reassembly. "How?" The sergeant stared at the disassembled rifle, then at Silas. "It's just a machine, Sergeant. Once you understand how the parts connect, you can take it apart in the dark." Sterling was watching from the doorway. "Neat trick, Slow Joe. Real impressive." His voice dripped contempt. "Now do it while someone's shooting at you." The laughter followed Silas everywhere after that. In the mess hall, on the obstacle course, during live-fire drills where Silas's accuracy was flawless but his pace was methodical, careful, every shot a calculation rather than an instinct. Sterling made sure everyone knew that fast mattered. That hesitation got you killed, that all the mechanical genius in the world meant nothing if you couldn't keep up. Silas never argued, never defended himself. He just kept his head down and his hands busy, fixing jammed weapons other recruits had given up on, improving the efficiency of their field packs, showing the quiet ones how to maintain their gear so it wouldn't fail when it mattered most. Sterling's contempt became the background hum of Silas's war, a constant reminder that the army didn't want thinkers. It wanted killers. And Silas Miller, the boy who saw the world in sequences and solutions, would never be what they wanted him to be. At least, that's what Sterling believed, right up until a frozen gorge in Belgium proved him catastrophically wrong. June 6, 1944. Silas hit Omaha Beach in the third wave, when the sand was already red and the air tasted like copper and smoke. He survived the beach not through heroics, but through arithmetic, calculating the safest route through the obstacles, moving when the German machine guns traversed away, staying low when physics said the bullets would pass overhead. By nightfall, he was inland with what remained of his platoon, stumbling through the Norman hedgerows that turned France into a maze of green walls and sudden death. The hedgerows were worse than the beach. Ancient earthen berms topped with thick vegetation, 8 feet high and centuries old, they carved the countryside into thousands of tiny kill zones. You couldn't see more than 20 yards in any direction. The Germans knew every inch. The Americans were blind. Most soldiers scavenged for ammunition, cigarettes, and German souvenirs to send home. Silas scavenged for wire. He found it everywhere the battle had passed. Telephone wire tangled in the hedgerows, steel cable from destroyed vehicles, even the springs from ruined field radios. While Sterling and the others searched dead Germans for Lugers and iron crosses, Silas filled his pack with scrap metal, discarded shell casings, and anything that could be bent, connected, or repurposed. "What are you doing, Slow Joe?" Sterling stood over him while Silas carefully wound copper wire around a stick. "Building a goddamn radio?" "No, Corporal." "Then what?" "Just collecting things that might be useful." Sterling kicked dirt onto Silas's pile of wire. "You know what's useful. Bullets, grenades, not trash." He walked away laughing. But Private Eugene Gopher Higgins didn't laugh. Gopher was 19 from Nebraska and scared of everything. The hedgerows, the snipers, the way you could die without ever seeing who killed you. He'd been assigned to watch the platoon's right flank, a narrow gap between two hedgerows where the Germans liked to probe at night. Silas found him on the third evening, hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. "Can't see nothing out there," Gopher whispered. "They could walk right up and I wouldn't know until it was too late." Silas looked at the gap, measuring angles and distances with his eyes. Then he opened his pack. It took 20 minutes. He strung wire across the gap at ankle height, so thin it was nearly invisible in the fading light. Then he attached 3 empty ration tins filled with pebbles, suspended them from a branch with springs he'd salvaged from a destroyed radio. The physics were simple. Trip the wire, release the tension, the tins fall and crash together. A bell, just like the ones he'd rigged for the coyotes back home. "Someone comes through that gap," Silas said, testing the tension one last time. "You'll hear them before you see them." Gopher stared at the contraption. "That'll really work. It works on coyotes. Should work on Germans." The probe came at 0200 hours. 4 German soldiers moving silent through the darkness, trying to flank the American position. The first man's boot caught the wire. The tins crashed down with a sound like church bells in the quiet night. Gopher opened fire. The platoon woke up shooting, and the Germans melted back into the darkness. In the morning, Sterling stood looking at Silas's warning system, the wire still intact, the tins scattered on the ground. "Cute," he said finally. "Real cute, Slow Joe. You're gonna rig bells for the whole damn army." But Gopher grabbed Silas's hand and shook it until Silas thought his arm might fall off. "That's a miracle," Gopher said, his voice thick. "That's a goddamn miracle. You saved my life." Silas packed up the wire. "It's just physics," he said. But in the hedgerows of Normandy, physics was starting to look a lot like salvation. By late summer, the platoon had pushed deeper into France, trading the hedgerows for shattered villages and muddy fields where the fighting happened in pulses. Intense firefights followed by days of waiting, digging, and watching the tree line for movement. It was during the waiting that Silas's mind became dangerous. He started with a simple observation. Grenades were inefficient. You threw one, it exploded. Maybe you got lucky and caught a few enemy soldiers in the blast radius. But most of the time, they scattered before the detonation, and you'd wasted ordnance on empty ground. What if you could make them scatter into the next explosion? And the next? What if you could chain them together? Linked ordnance, Silas called it. He tried to explain the concept to Sergeant Buck Callahan one evening while the platoon dug foxholes outside a destroyed farmhouse. Buck was a good sergeant, fair, competent, more interested in keeping his men alive than collecting medals. He listened to Silas for about 30 seconds. "So you want to... what? Tie grenades together?" "Not tie them. Link them in sequence. Gravity-fed triggers." Silas sketched in the dirt with a stick. "You position them at different heights. The first one detonates, severs a support line. The next one falls and detonates, severs the next line. Each explosion triggers the next in a cascade. Instead of one blast, you get 5, 10, 20, all timed to catch the enemy as they try to escape the first one." Buck stared at the sketch, then at Silas, then back at the sketch. "Slow Joe, I need you to shut up and dig. We got real work to do." "But Sergeant, the mathematics—" "I don't care about your mathematics. I care about a defensive perimeter before dark. Now dig." Sterling, of course, had been listening from his own foxhole. "Let him play with his toys, Sarge. Maybe he'll invent a machine that digs holes for us." The laughter rippled through the platoon like it always did. But Silas kept tinkering. In the quiet hours after midnight, when the others slept or stood watch, he worked by moonlight with the scraps he'd collected. Practice grenades with the explosives removed, wire and springs and tin cans. He built prototypes on a flat section of ground behind the farmhouse, testing tensions, calculating drop times, refining the trigger mechanisms. The first prototype failed. The grenades fell but didn't detonate in sequence. The timing was wrong. The second prototype worked too well. The cascade happened so fast the explosions overlapped, wasting energy instead of maximizing coverage. The third prototype was elegant. Each detonation gave the next one exactly enough time to fall and position itself before exploding. The sequence rippled outward like dominoes made of thunder. Silas sat back and watched the empty practice grenades tumble in perfect order, his mind already calculating how many he could link together, how much ground he could cover, how many lives he could save or take with the right setup. He didn't know he was building a weapon that would kill 119 men in 14 seconds. He just knew he was solving a problem. That's what he did. That's all he'd ever done. In the darkness behind a French farmhouse on Now, while his platoon slept and Sterling dreamed of glory, Silas Miller perfected the physics of death. And nobody was watching. Are you a tinkerer or a traditionalist? Drop a comment if you've ever been laughed at for a stupid idea that actually worked. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Winter came to the Ardennes like a hammer. December 16th, 1944. The platoon was dug in along a quiet sector of the Belgian-German border, a stretch of thick forest and snow-covered hills that everyone said was too difficult for a major offensive. The Germans wouldn't attack through the Ardennes. The terrain was impossible. The weather was worse. Command had pulled the experienced divisions out for rest and replacements, leaving green troops and exhausted veterans to hold a line that supposedly didn't need holding. Then the forest exploded. At 0530 hours, the entire German artillery corps opened fire. Thousands of guns all at once, turning the winter dawn into a wall of sound and fire. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. 90 minutes of the earth trying to shake itself apart, of trees disintegrating into splinters, of men screaming prayers that couldn't be heard over the thunder. When the guns finally stopped, the German infantry came through the smoke like ghosts. Not a probe, not a raid. An army. 3 entire armies. 250,000 men and 1,400 tanks, driving west through the impossible terrain with one goal: split the Allied line, reach the coast, and turn the war back around. Operation Watch on the Rhine. Hitler's desperate gamble. The last great German offensive of World War II, and the American line shattered like glass. Silas's company held for 6 hours. Then the position on their left collapsed. Then the position on their right. Then Sergeant Buck Callahan was shouting orders to fall back, and the orderly defense turned into a scrambling retreat through snow and mud and the constant crack of rifle fire from the trees. They weren't fighting anymore. They were running. The chaos was absolute. Units mixed together. Officers lost their commands. Soldiers threw away equipment just to move faster through the drifts. The roads were clogged with vehicles trying to escape the German advance. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, all grinding toward the rear in a mechanical panic, while panzers rolled closer every hour. Sterling was in his element. He kept yelling at stragglers to move faster, grabbing exhausted men by their coats and dragging them forward, his voice cutting through the confusion like a blade. This was what he understood. Pure survival. Strength against strength. The simple mathematics of run or die. Silas watched it all with a different kind of focus. He saw the bottlenecks where the retreating columns compressed into narrow defiles. He saw the predictable routes the Germans would take to cut them off. He saw the terrain features that could be defended, the choke points that could be controlled, the places where physics mattered more than firepower. While others panicked, Silas calculated. The company stumbled through 2 days of retreat, sleeping in frozen ditches, eating whatever they could scavenge, always moving west away from the grinding sound of German armor. On the second night, Buck gathered the remaining officers around a map by flashlight. "We need to cross open ground tomorrow," he said, his finger tracing a valley between 2 ridges. 20 minutes of exposure. Maybe more. If the Germans catch us in the open, we're done." "How far behind are they?" someone asked. "Close. Maybe an hour. Maybe less." The map showed one path forward, through a narrow gorge the locals called the bottleneck. Steep walls on both sides, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles. The perfect defensive position. The perfect killing ground. If someone stayed behind to hold it. Buck looked up from the map, his eyes scanning the exhausted faces of his men. "We need a rear guard. Someone to buy us those 20 minutes. The silence was complete. Every man understood what rear guard meant in a retreat this desperate. It meant dying alone so your friends could live. Then Silas Miller raised his hand. "I'll do it," he said quietly, and Sterling started laughing. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a full-body laugh, the kind that bent him at the waist and made other men look away in embarrassment. When he finally straightened up, wiping his eyes, Sterling's grin was vicious. "Slow Joe wants to be a hero." He turned to Buck. "Sarge, you gonna let the farm boy get himself killed playing rear guard?" Buck studied Silas in the flashlight's glow. "You understand what you're volunteering for?" "Yes, Sergeant." "It's a suicide mission, Miller. Best case, you slow them down and die quick. Worst case." "I understand, Sergeant." Silas's voice was steady. "But I need supplies." "Supplies?" Sterling laughed again. "What, you want a machine gun nest? Bazookas?" "Maybe a tank." "Grenades," Silas said. "As many as we can spare, and fishing line." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rumble of German artillery. Sterling looked at Buck. Buck looked at Silas. Every man around that map thought the same thing. The kid had finally cracked. "Fishing line," Sterling repeated slowly. "You want to hold off the German army with fishing line. And grenades, Corporal." Sterling stepped close enough that Silas could feel his breath. "You know what? Fine. Give the kid his toys. Maybe he'll distract them for 5 minutes while he dies. At least he'll die doing what he loves, playing with scrap metal." Buck raised a hand before Sterling could continue. "How many grenades, Miller?" "All of them. Every one we can spare." They gave him 120. Every platoon contributed from their dwindling supplies. Mark II pineapples mostly, plus a few German stick grenades scavenged from the retreat. The men stacked them in ammunition crates while Silas checked his pack. Fishing line, wire cutters, a hammer, and a spool of thin steel cable he'd been carrying since Normandy. At 0400 hours on December 23rd, the company prepared to move. The plan was simple. Silas would hold the bottleneck while they crossed the exposed valley. 20 minutes. That's all they needed. 20 minutes to reach the defensive positions on the ridge. Nobody expected Silas to last that long. Buck shook his hand in the darkness. "You're a good soldier, Miller." "Just doing what needs doing, Sergeant." The company filed past, some men nodding, some too exhausted to look up. Gopher Higgins stopped and grabbed Silas's shoulder. "That bell you made saved my life. I won't forget that." "Take care of yourself, Gopher." Then they were gone, boots crunching through snow, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Sterling was the last to leave. He stood at the gorge entrance, the weak moonlight catching his smirk. "See you in hell, Slow Joe." Then he was gone too. Silas stood alone in the bottleneck, surrounded by crates of grenades and coils of fishing line. The gorge walls rose 30 feet on either side, the ground between them barely wide enough for 2 trucks. Behind him, his company was running for their lives. Ahead of him, somewhere in the darkness, 119 German soldiers were coming to cut them down. He checked his father's pocket watch. He had maybe an hour, maybe less. He opened the first crate and got to work. The boy who had trapped coyotes was about to trap an army. And nobody, not Sterling, not Buck, not even Silas himself, truly understood what he was building in the darkness. Not until the wire sang. Silas worked by feel as much as sight. The moon gave just enough light to see the gorge walls, those 30-foot slopes of frozen earth and exposed rock that funneled everything, wind, sound, death, into a single killing channel. He'd walked the length of the bottleneck twice before beginning, measuring distances with his stride, calculating angles with his eyes, seeing not a ravine, but a mathematical problem waiting to be solved. The design formed in his mind like a blueprint, a cascading V pattern, 2 lines of grenades running up both walls, each one suspended by fishing line at precisely calculated heights. When the first grenade detonated, its shrapnel would sever the line holding the next one. That grenade would fall, detonate on impact with the slope, and sever the line above it. A chain reaction flowing upward and outward, each explosion triggering the next in perfect sequence. Not random, not chaos, a symphony of physics. He started with the anchor points. Using the hammer and steel spikes scavenged from a destroyed fence, he drove anchors into the frozen earth every 8 feet along both walls. His hands were numb within minutes, but he kept hammering, kept checking angles, kept calculating the tension needed to hold a 2-pound grenade at a 45-degree angle. Then came the fishing line, 20-pound test, thin enough to be nearly invisible, strong enough to hold until the moment it needed to break. He tied each grenade with a modified slip knot. His father had taught him that knot for trapping, that would release the safety spoon when the line was cut. The grenades would fall armed, a 4-second fuse burning as they tumbled toward the ground. The mathematics were elegant. The first explosion would trigger 2 more, positioned to catch anyone trying to escape the initial blast. Those 2 would trigger 4 more, then 8, then 16. A geometric progression of death flowing up the ravine walls in both directions, the blast pattern expanding to cover every square foot of the gorge floor. 120 grenades, 119 targets. 14 seconds from first contact to final detonation. He worked for 43 minutes, his fingers bleeding from the wire, his breath coming in white clouds. Twice he had to adjust the angles when the tension wasn't right. Once he had to replace a grenade whose pin had loosened during the rigging. Precision mattered. One miscalculation and the entire cascade would fail. The final element was the simplest. A single tripwire stretched across the mouth of the gorge at ankle height. Fishing line again, anchored to a rusted fence post on one side and a birch tree on the other, connected to the first grenade on each wall. When that wire broke, everything else followed. Silas tested the tension 3 times, pulled it gently with his finger, checking the give, calculating the force needed to snap it. Too tight and it might break from wind or debris. Too loose and a careful soldier might step over it. He adjusted it twice more before he was satisfied. Then he retreated 30 yards up the gorge, found a depression in the ground that offered cover from the blast pattern, and settled in to wait. His father's pocket watch read 0547. Behind him, his company was crossing open ground. Ahead of him, the German vanguard was closing in. The trap was set. The mathematics were perfect. The physics were sound. All that remained was the proof. The Germans came at 14:47 hours, 2:47 in the afternoon, by Silas's pocket watch. He heard them before he saw them, the sound of boots on frozen ground multiplied by 100. Command shouted in German, the metallic rattle of equipment. They weren't being cautious. They were sprinting, racing to catch the retreating Americans before they could reach the ridge. 119 men, elite infantry from the 6th Panzer Army's vanguard, young, experienced, desperate to exploit the breakthrough. They entered the bottleneck at a full run, packed tight by the narrow walls, their focus on the prize ahead rather than the ground beneath their feet. Silas pressed himself into the depression, hands over his ears, mouth open to equalize the pressure. He'd done the calculations. He knew what was coming. The lead soldier never saw the wire. His boot caught it mid-stride. The fishing line snapped with a sound like a single guitar string breaking. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the first grenade on each wall released, tumbling down the slope with their fuses already burning. They detonated simultaneously. The sound wasn't just loud, it was foundational. A pair of thunderclaps that shook the earth and sent shrapnel screaming across the gorge floor. The lead soldiers went down instantly. But the cascade had already begun. The explosion severed the lines above them. 2 more grenades fell, then 4, then 8. The detonations rippled up both walls in geometric progression, each blast perfectly timed to catch the men trying to scatter from the one before. The narrow gorge amplified everything. The sound, the pressure, the shrapnel bouncing off stone walls and finding flesh. Silas counted in his head, matching the rhythm he'd calculated. 1, 2, 3, 4. The explosions merged into a continuous roar, a wall of sound and fire that consumed the gorge. Men screamed but couldn't be heard. Men ran but had nowhere to go. The walls that had funneled them into the killing zone now trapped them inside it. 5, 6, 7, 8. The cascade reached its peak. 16 grenades detonating almost simultaneously, creating a vacuum of fire so intense it sucked the air from Silas's lungs even 30 yards away. The pressure wave hit him like a physical blow, and he pressed harder into the frozen dirt. 9, 10, 11, 12. The final sequence. The grenades at the top of the pattern, designed to catch anyone who'd somehow survived the initial waves. They fell in pairs, their explosions sharp and distinct now. Punctuation marks on the symphony of destruction. 13, 14. Then silence. Not real silence. Silas's ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear his own breathing. But the absence of explosions felt like silence. The absence of screaming felt like silence. The absence of everything except smoke and the smell of cordite and something else, something worse, that Silas didn't want to name. He stayed in the depression for 30 seconds, counting his heartbeat, waiting to see if anyone would return fire. Nothing. Only the wind pushing smoke through the gorge, only the small sounds of debris still falling, only the ringing in his ears that might never stop. Silas pulled out his pocket watch. The crystal was cracked from the pressure wave, but it still worked. From the moment the wire broke to the final explosion. 14 seconds. He stood on shaking legs and looked down into the bottleneck. The smoke was clearing now, revealing what the mathematics had created. 119 men had entered the gorge at a sprint. None of them would leave. The physics had been perfect. The cascade had worked exactly as designed. The stupid trap that Sterling had mocked, that Buck had dismissed, that every traditional soldier would have called impossible, it had done what an entire battalion couldn't do. Silas Miller sat down in the dirt, pocket watch still in his hand, and waited for someone to find him. He didn't look at the gorge again. He didn't need to. He'd seen the mathematics. He knew the result. The wire had sung its song, and death had answered in perfect harmony. They found him 2 hours later. Buck Callahan led the patrol back through the bottleneck, moving carefully, weapons ready, expecting to find a body or nothing at all. What they found was Silas Miller sitting cross-legged in the dirt, 30 yards from the tripwire, a German pocket watch in his hands, using a bent paperclip to fix the broken mainspring. He looked up when they approached. "Wire snapped on this one," he said quietly, holding up the watch. "Thought I could fix it." Buck stared at him, then past him, down into the gorge where the smoke still drifted between walls, scorched black from the explosions. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The mathematics of what they were seeing didn't make sense. One farm boy, 120 grenades, and a killing ground so complete that even the snow had burned away. Sterling was there too, at the back of the patrol. He pushed forward, opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. For the first time since basic training, Corporal Vance Sterling had nothing to say. "How many?" Buck asked finally. Silas set down the watch. "All of them, Sergeant. The whole vanguard." "Jesus Christ." Buck looked back at the gorge, then at Silas. "Jesus Christ, Miller." They walked him back to the company in silence. Men stared as he passed. This quiet kid with dirt on his face and a German watch in his pocket. Gopher Higgins grabbed his hand and wouldn't let go for a full minute. Other soldiers just nodded, not knowing what else to do with the knowledge that Slow Joe had saved every one of their lives. Buck tried to put him in for a Medal of Honor, wrote up the entire action, documented the body count, called it the most effective use of limited ordnance in the history of modern warfare. Silas read the recommendation and refused to sign it. "It was just a trap, Sergeant." "That trap saved the entire company." "Then the company's safe. That's all that matters." Buck never submitted the paperwork. Silas Miller remained a private for the rest of the war. VE Day came in May 1945. Silas Miller went home to Ohio, took over his father's farm, and spent the next 50 years fixing tractors. He married a schoolteacher named Anne, raised 3 children who never knew their father had killed 119 men in 14 seconds, and lived a quiet life among the cornfields where he'd learned to see the world in sequences and solutions. When people asked about the war, and after a few beers someone always asked, Silas would set down his wrench, wipe his hands on a rag, and say the same thing every time. "I did what needed doing." Nothing more, nothing less. He never spoke of the gorge, never mentioned Sterling's mockery or Buck's recommendation, or the sound of 120 grenades cascading through a Belgian ravine. The war existed in a locked room inside his head, and he never opened the door. Silas Miller died in 1996 at the age of 71, surrounded by family, his hands still calloused from a lifetime of fixing things that broke. The local paper ran a small obituary mentioning his service in the 82nd Airborne. It didn't mention the bottleneck. Most people who read it assumed he'd been a regular soldier, nothing special, just another veteran who came home and lived his life. The classified after-action reports from December 1944 told a different story. They described a defensive action of unprecedented efficiency and a unique application of ordnance that military strategists would study for decades. But those reports were filed away in archives where the public would never see them. The only people who truly remembered were the men who'd been there. Buck Callahan, who never forgot the kid sitting in the dirt, fixing a watch while smoke rose from a gorge full of the dead. Gopher Higgins, who named his firstborn son Silas and never explained why. And Corporal Vance Sterling, who carried the memory of his own mocking words, "Give the kid his toys," like a stone in his chest for the rest of his life. The stupid trap that saved a company. The farm boy who outthought an army. The quiet hero of the Ardennes who chose silence over celebration. Tractors over medals, and a life of simple service over a legacy of war. Silas Miller fixed things. That's what he did. That's all he ever wanted to do. Even when the thing that needed fixing was broken men retreating through snow, and the only tool he had was physics, fishing line, and the farm boy genius everyone had dismissed as stupid. If you think Silas Miller's genius deserves to be remembered, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Let's see how far the farm boy's story travels. And if you've ever been called slow or stupid for thinking differently, this one's for you. Subscribe for more untold stories of brilliant minds in impossible moments.